For this video, I'm going to be making a watch box with a hexagon pattern lid. To start this off, I'm going to be preparing some walnut and maple strips, which I'm cutting out 20 by 3mm. This number can be adjusted if you want to do something larger or a bit more intricate. I cut my strips 2mm oversized so that I could take them down to the final thickness on the drum sander. After that, I glued them in contrasting layers, going light for walnut, dark for maple. While letting those strips dry, I also glued up my top and bottom plate, which are also made from maple. It doesn't matter too much what material I use here, as I'm going to be installing fabric which will cover these top and bottom plates. Now that we've got all the material prepared, I can move on to making the hexagons. One important thing I forgot to mention is that I took one of the outer layers to half thickness compared to the rest of the layers, so that when you double them up, the hexagon pattern does not look as bulky. Next, I'm going to set my bandsaw up to 30 degrees and I'm going to make a cut on each side of the strip. By doing this, you will get a triangle strip, and once you've got 6 of those, you will be able to make a hexagon. If you plan on making something like this yourself, one thing to keep in mind is that you want the thinner layer on the outside. Once I've applied glue and rolled it up, I'm going to let it sit overnight and come back tomorrow. Now that the glue's all dry, I'm going to be cutting them into 4mm coins. It's quite tricky to run one at a time through a drum sander, so I'm applying quite a few to some masking tape so that they hold a better form. Thin shapes like these always have a tendency to be quite weak when they're glued by themselves. I normally add them to a separate board, and the shapes end up acting as a sort of veneer on that board. Small pieces like these always have a tendency to shift over time as the wood expands and contracts, so I always recommend adding a thin layer of epoxy. Next, I'm going to be making the tongue and groove so that the lid can attach to the oak frame of the box. I always take my time doing something like this, as I do not want any hexagons tearing out. Now that we've done the tongue side, we can move on to doing the groove side. You really should take your time on this part, doing around 3 or 4 passes. If you get greedy and take too much, the router has a tendency to bind, which it did after this clip. Now that I've finished that, I'm going to move on to making the actual shape of the box. I'm just doing 45s and making sure that the groove side is on the inside. For now, I'm just doing a thin layer of epoxy to fill in any gaps or cracks that may have occurred, and later on I'll be doing a thin flood coat. Things are starting to come together now, so I'm going to move on to making the inside frame which will hold the watches. It's important to measure 2mm down from the inside diameter of the box, as that gap's going to be filled with fabric that we install later on. I cut out small slots on the blocks that separate the watches, and then I'm doing the opposite for the back and front plate. Now that I've got all the pieces cut out, we can make sure everything fits properly and has the correct gap between each one. Once we know everything fits properly, we can remove the inside frame and then glue everything up. This is the first time I've fully maxed out my bandsaw making a cut. I even had to thin the frame of the box down by 1/2 mm just to get it to go through. Once again, because my bandsaw is not the best, I had to spend some time putting it through the drum sander just to get both sides flat. Now we get to move on to doing the hinges. I'm spending a fair bit of time marking it out with a marking tool just to make sure I'm getting everything perfect, as you don't want any gap. It's moments like these where I feel like an actual woodworker. I hardly use my hand tools anymore. And even though I learned joinery in college, I hardly install any hinges or do any actual woodworking joints. I really took my time doing this, making relief cuts and just taking it slow and steady. Any wood gaps next to a hinge just looks absolutely disgusting. Once we know the hinges fit properly, we're going to want to mark out a little circle where the screws are going to go and then drill out that spot. If you were to screw straight into the wood, then it would more than likely crack on something thin and close to the edge like this. Once we know that the hinges fit perfectly and the box works just fine, we can move on to sanding all of the components. For the main frame of the box, I sanded up to 240, but for the epoxy, I sanded up to 3000 for a glossy finish. I didn't take much footage of cutting out and gluing the suede, so I'm going to do a little walkthrough of what I did. So cutting out the suede for the top and bottom part of the box was very simple, just a long rectangle. The inside is a bit more complex, however. I cut out 12 smaller rectangles for the front and back plate and larger rectangles with a little slot to hang over the edge for the middle components. It may look a little janky, but once everything's put in, it will look seamless and there will be no gaps. Now before we move on to the final shots, I want to do a quick mention that my website is now 20% off for all orders from now up until Christmas. So if you want to buy a present for a family member or feel like treating yourself, I recommend checking it out. If you like this build and want to see more like it, please consider dropping a like or even subscribing. Anyway, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.